Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker, and in this video I have been asked by my patrons to offer my predictions of what may come of Jehovah's Witnesses or indeed the Watchtower Society, their leadership in the coming years and decades. And this is actually a tricky question to answer, and I guess I should begin with the obvious disclaimer that I am not clairvoyant. I cannot foretell the future. I do not claim any kind of prophetic ability. This is purely, anything that I offer in this video is purely speculation based on what I've experienced or what I've observed with this religion, having been fairly involved in activism work over the last few years. One thing that I think we can say with reasonable certainty is that there will be change in the coming years and decades. Why? Because we've seen a lot of change already. I was actually talking about this with Deanna before making this video, and we both agreed that the religion today is already so different from the religion that we both remember. In so many ways, the focus on the jw.org website and its logo, which in our day would have been, in our day as though we're old people, in my day, that would have been considered idolatry. And in other areas as well, the increased focus on the governing body and the way they are now front center. And previously we didn't really know who they were. Now they are in HD videos all the time on the JW Broadcasting website, which, as I discussed in my Bottlegate video, has its drawbacks. Because once you're famous, people will recognize you, including when you're in compromising situations. But I won't go there again. Sure, to put it bluntly, there have been a lot of changes. And so when I sit down and write a list of possible changes coming up in the future, it's worth mentioning that, you know, all bets are off. Anything could happen. I could make one prediction and the entire opposite could happen. So with all of those disclaimers out of the way, I thought I would begin by talking about the teachings. It's difficult to predict what new light, what new teachings the governing body might come up with in the future. One thing that seems to be quite a popular belief among ex-witnesses is this idea that eventually the governing body has to drop the 144,000 teaching. That is, the teaching that 144,000 is a literal number rather than a symbolic number. And this is something that in the publications they have stubbornly stuck to over the years. No, it's not symbolic, it's literal. There are literally 144,000 Christians going all the way back to Jesus who get to rule in heaven with Christ over the paradise earth. This, of course, this teaching was refined, you could say, by Joseph Rutherford in 1935 when he introduced the concept of the other sheep, those who get to live on paradise earth, which is obviously the majority of witnesses, because the organization's kind of grown much bigger than 144,000. So anyway, ex-witnesses tend to think that this is a teaching that has to be jettisoned because year after year, well, especially in recent years, since they distanced themselves from 1935 as the cutoff date for becoming one of the anointed, in recent years, the number of people partaking of the memorial emblems in other words, those declaring themselves to be of the anointed, part of the 144,000, has gone up and up and up. Don't know what the figures are right now, but they are problematic if you hold to the idea that throughout the 2 millennia since Jesus, there are only 144,000. So a disproportionate number, it would seem, of those kind of the cream of the crop of Christianity over 2,000 years are suddenly revealing themselves in the 20th and 21st centuries. So that's why I think lots of ex-witnesses find it untenable or unsustainable moving forward. There has to reach a point where, okay, it's obvious that there are more than 144,000 who claim to go to heaven. I actually don't think it matters how many claim to be of the 144,000, because the organization has already made it clear that not everyone who claims to go to heaven is going to heaven. It was actually the August 15th, 2011 Watchtower in the questions from readers where they said a number of factors, including past religious beliefs or even mental or emotional imbalance, might cause some to assume mistakenly that they have the heavenly calling. Of course, the only group of men that this doesn't apply to, who don't get to have their mental or emotional state of mind questioned, is the governing body. But they've said that everyone else basically doesn't get to just assert that they are going to heaven. So I think that they've already kind of dealt with the 144,000 issue. I could be wrong. They could surprise me and say, no, we've changed our minds. We now think it's a symbolic number, even though we've been saying for decades that it isn't. But that's kind of my take on the whole 144,000 issue. The really big thing that at some point in the organization's further development, you could say, that they need to address is 1914, because it's already, you could argue, a date from the distant past. We're already over 100 years since 1914, and yet they've stuck to it quite determinedly. It's mentioned in the 2013 New World Translation revision. It's mentioned in the new Pure Worship prophetic book that was released at the last annual meeting. The current leadership lacks, it seems, the imagination to move past this theology that they inherited, that obviously can be traced right back to Russell. But although Russell's understanding of what 1914 meant differed from subsequent generations, of course. But at some point, there's going to have to be a governing body member who has the imagination and the, you could argue, courage, I guess, to say in a governing body meeting, chaps, do you think we might have got that one wrong? And when that conversation takes place, I see there being two options for the governing body. I think that they will either have to acknowledge that 607 BCE is not the date of Jerusalem's destruction. They're going to have to acknowledge that this in fact happened sometime between 587 586 BCE. In other words, 20 years after they've been saying for decades in their publications that Jerusalem was destroyed. You know, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons why that is. If you are a Jehovah's Witness and you have no idea what I'm talking about, this is the video that you need to watch to understand why we know. It's just not even a theory. It's not even guesswork. We know that Jerusalem couldn't have been destroyed when Watchtower says it was destroyed. But interestingly, when you accept the date of historians and archaeologists. What it does is it buys you another 20 years. So if you have to use this bizarre 2,520 year period that was dreamt up in the 19th century, not just by Russell. I mean, 2,520 years goes all the way back to the Adventist movement, of course. There were others who thought that 2,520 years must be this period of 7 times. So if you then apply this 2,520 year period that Russell retrofitted to his theology, what that does is it gives you another 20 years for the start of Christ's presence. It's a fairly innocuous year, obviously, 1934, but nevertheless, you've got a bit more time. I'm sure Watchtower could come up with something that happened of note in that year that, has some kind of significance. It would be a stretch, I admit, but at least they'd be giving themselves a little bit more time. I personally don't favour that option. I think that it would be shutting the barn door long after the horse has bolted for them to do that. I think if they do wish to distance themselves from 1914, the most realistic option is that they entirely drop the half-baked 19th century quackery end-time chronology involving 2,520 years in favour of far more vague claims that, we are Jehovah's organisation because what other organisation would do this, what other organisation would do that. In other words, they would, as I've said in previous videos, simply revert to the box-ticking exercise that most witnesses use already to argue that theirs is God's one true organisation. They no longer need, as I've already argued, some kind of anchor point in history to establish that this is when God's organisation was chosen. If you speak to witnesses, as I have done, most are very hazy on the whole issue of 1919 anyway. So it's a bit of a silly vestige of their forebears that they are clinging on to for dear life for want of imagination and, again, some degree of courage. But at some point, especially as we get further and further away from 1914, and we already are too far away as far as I'm concerned, it's just going to be an elephant in the room that they're going to have to address. Another interesting teaching that I thought of was other worlds, other planets potentially being considered to be a place for humankind to be so that the paradise is no longer confined to planet Earth, but humans could be assigned to other planets. And this may seem ridiculous. Lloyd, what are you on about now? This is not Mormonism, Lloyd. We don't all get our own planet. But if you think about it, first of all, there's one thing that may make that significant or relevant, and that's if, as seems very likely, life is discovered beyond our biosphere. In other words, if they find evidence of life on other planets, or even perhaps on, interstellar meteors, for example, or asteroids. I don't know what the exact terms are. If they find evidence of life outside our planet, it may make it relevant for them to at least float the idea that maybe God's plan is for humans to live on other planets and not just planet Earth. And another reason why that might be necessary is that according to the current theology, after Armageddon, everyone who has ever died who hasn't specifically rejected Jehovah's Witness teachings should, in theory, be resurrected. And if you think of how many billions of people that will be, there's simply not enough room on the planet for the amount of people that will be resurrected. I realize that this may be confusing for some of you who don't know much about the teachings. Basically, when Armageddon comes, 7.5 billion people are going to die for having not become Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what Armageddon is for. Your only way through Armageddon is to become a Jehovah's Witness. And even some witnesses who aren't sufficiently involved in warning people about Armageddon, they too will die. That's how serious this is. But once the dust settles, then the resurrection begins, and witnesses interpret a verse about a resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous as meaning that even unrighteous people who never became worshippers of Jehovah will be resurrected and they will be given the chance to worship Jehovah, which again is just way too many people. Way more people than the earth can sustain. Now, without wanting to get too sidetracked on this point, interestingly, this very question was dealt with in the now out-of-print book Reasoning from the Scriptures, which all witnesses, including myself, used to carry with them to the doorstep. In a paragraph under the heading, "If billions are to be raised from the dead, where will they all live?" The paragraph said, "A very liberal estimate of the number of people who have ever lived on Earth is 20 billion. As we have seen, not all of these will be resurrected, but even if we assume that they would be, there would be ample room." Bear in mind, just think about how silly that is. Think of how the Earth, the ecosystem, is currently kind of struggling in terms of climate change, with 7.5 billion as it is, without amping that up to 20 billion. And they're saying, oh, there'll be ample room. And they say the land surface of the earth at present is about 57 million square miles. If half of that was set aside for other purposes, there would still be just a little less than an acre per person, which can provide more than enough food. At the root of present food shortages is not any inability of the earth to produce sufficient, but rather political rivalry and commercial greed. So I think that obviously this book was released in, I think, 1985. So a lot of water under the bridge since then. The Earth's population has gone up significantly since that time, and there's obviously more people who would need to be resurrected. So those calculations are already woefully out of date. And that's why my mind wandered when tackling this question. I was thinking maybe they're going to have to expand the paradise to more than just the Earth's biosphere. Anyway, moving on. I fully expect there to be more of a circling of the wagons on Armageddon, homophobia and shunning. We saw in the last few conventions videos about the Great Tribulation, terrifying witnesses into believing that the authorities are coming for them with guns, that they're going to get herded in a field somewhere, having escaped through the woods. I fully expect there to be more of this ahead in the future. I think that the very kind of astonishing doomsday artwork in the Pure Worship book, I think there will be more of that coming, both in picture form and also in video form, because unfortunately we're dealing with a fundamentalist doomsday organization. And I don't expect the leaders to back down from that course they seem to have embarked on. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that Armageddon, the Armageddon teaching, is only going to get more severe, you could say, from now on. And the same of the homophobia, especially in the last few years, there's been quite a crusade against gay people with cartoons, videos, worksheets, and all sorts. Expect more of that. Expect more shameless encouragement or instructions for believing family members to shun disfellowshipped ones. Here's an interesting one, the blood teaching. I was thinking, what will be the future of the blood teaching? I think that the blood issue or the blood prohibition will become less of an issue, not necessarily because of anything Watchtower is saying, but purely because medical science will come to the rescue. There's huge strides already been made in terms of making artificial blood available. I keep hearing that it's almost there, but clearly when you go to the hospital, they're still reliant on people donating blood. But surely at some point in the future, we will reach the stage where personal donations of blood are no longer needed because artificial blood is sufficiently developed and available for it to no longer be an issue for witnesses to refuse blood. And then hopefully, I really hope then witnesses will stop dying from refusing blood, because if blood is artificial, in other words, it's not been harvested from a living being, then arguably there's no reason to refuse it. And indeed, hemoglobin, which is the main kind of component that circulates oxygen in blood, is already on the list of fractions that witnesses are allowed to have. So I expect the blood teaching to become less of an issue, not again because of any climb down on Watchtower's part, but because of medical technology coming to the rescue. There could be a little bit more of a climb down from Watchtower, if only because I think that they, at some level, they must know that this is something that they've just been lumbered with by previous leaders, and that they can't get rid of it if they wanted to, because if they did, they would suddenly be making themselves liable for the deaths of, I would say, tens of thousands who've refused blood and died as a result. One reasonable climb down that I think that they could make without abandoning the blood prohibition is to abolish the HLC arrangement. At least that way, it's truly a personal choice on the part of Jehovah's Witnesses. You could argue that even then, witnesses would be receiving coercion because it's all in the literature. But at least if they're not being coerced and manipulated at the side of their hospital beds at their bleakest hour, at least then they've got a little bit of personal choice in the matter. So that's one very simple, straightforward, painless reform that Watchtower might consider making. Again, whether they do or not is another matter entirely. But those are just a few teachings that I expect could fluctuate or change in some way. Let's move on to the more administrative side. I expect in the future there to be more branch closures and laying off of Bethelites. It seems as though with the downsizing we've already had, that the operations have already been stripped down significantly. But for example, here in Croatia, we still have our local branch office in Zagreb. I'm counting the years until that gets closed down. I think that it will increasingly get centralized, so that, for example, Europe is run out of Celtas in Germany and or the Britain branch, and then who knows, maybe even then there won't be a branch at some point. I think that what Watchtower is most anxious to protect is the headquarters and the headquarters facilities, and everything else basically services the kind of the hub of the organization in the New York area. So I expect more branch closures and cost saving in terms of facilities in the future. I also expect more congregation closures and mergers. Again, a lot of this isn't even a prediction. We're already seeing it. We're seeing this play out in real time. I do expect at some point, hopefully in the near future, the numbers of publishers to enter negative growth. And I think that when that happens, the obvious excuse that's going to get offered by the organization is, oh, the love of the greater number is cooling off. That's the kind of ready-made excuse, I think, for witnesses to be able to interpret a decrease in numbers. And I do expect, the numbers are already stagnant, so they've been at 1.4% growth for the last 2 reporting years. 1.4% is just basically head barely above water because, as I've already mentioned previously, the birth-death ratio takes you to something like 1%. So they are basically keeping afloat just by making babies at this point. And so it seems almost inevitable, if you look at the kind of the curve, that at some point it's going to dip into negative growth. You could argue that it's already happened. We just don't know about it because, it's not beyond Watchtower, is it, to cook the books slightly? But that is an unsustainable strategy. At some point, you've just got to throw your hands up and say, actually, the growth is now negative. So one way or the other, I think we're going to find our way to negative growth at some point. I expect this is a fairly safe prediction, if there is such a thing. I think that magazine printing will cease. That was already hinted at, I think, a couple of years back, not the last annual meeting, but the one before. I think Tony Morris said that they were going to keep an eye on the situation with magazines, but I expect them to distance themselves fully from printing any magazines for the public. Well, that's my prediction anyway. And I think that not long after that, we'll start to see the ending of all printing, apart from Bibles and maybe books that are used by witnesses at their meetings. It just seems a no-brainer that if an organization is struggling financially, and there's already plenty of evidence that they are struggling financially, you cut everything out that's unnecessary. And already when you have such a focus on doing research online and using the JW Library app, why do you need to produce printed literature? Why not just point people to PDFs and that kind of thing? So to the extent that they can get away with, I believe that they will eliminate printing as much as they possibly can. And that's, again, I think a fairly safe prediction. Another interesting possibility I came up with was, we've already seen the way that kingdom halls are being sold and congregations are being merged and witnesses are being told that they need to travel further. If you want a more extensive commentary on this, by the way, go to my Unrighteous Riches video, in which I explained a full strategy there. But it wouldn't surprise me if this gets extended even more, so that maybe assembly halls start getting sold off. Maybe they feel that they can get away without having the circuit assemblies or the assembly days. They could, I suppose, if they wanted to, get rid of the conventions, but I think that they are already kind of keen on using the conventions as like a propaganda rally of showing all of these videos. But again, it costs money to organize conventions, and it's whether they are receiving enough through donations to justify keeping the conventions going. So it will be interesting to see what becomes of the whole assembly convention arrangement moving forward. But what I expect to happen is that eventually, with few or no kingdom halls or assembly halls, this is my kind of vision for the future. I expect loyal Jehovah's Witnesses will have to sustain their faith privately. I expect them to have to travel huge distances increasingly huge distances to attend gatherings. I think being a Jehovah's Witness in future decades will be more about keeping a candle burning in your own home for a religion that has dwindled to such an irrelevance that you can't really find evidence of it in terms of kingdom halls or large gatherings. It's something that people have to do kind of privately. That when I imagine what it would be like to be a Jehovah's Witness in, say, 50 years from now, that's what I'm imagining. I think that there's a very likely possibility of Watchtower going bankrupt. I've spoken about this before. Any organization that can get into debt, that can have a deficit, in other words, they've spent more money than they brought in, and therefore they have to loan it from someone. You're not telling me Watchtower doesn't loan money from banks. Any organization that can do that is at risk of going bankrupt, especially if that organization is fighting off lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, and very costly lawsuits, as we saw was the case in Montana. It seems to me, I know I've been saying this for years now, and it hasn't happened, but I just wonder how sustainable it is for basically. To avoid going bankrupt, Watchtower needs drastic downsizing, even more drastic than we've already seen. If they can downsize drastically enough and fast enough, they might avoid bankruptcy. But even then, there are no guarantees. So it will be fascinating to see what happens moving forward. But even if Watchtower were to go bankrupt, I believe the religion would still continue. So that you would have, as I mentioned earlier, that scenario of being a Jehovah's Witness being a private thing that your family does, and it's no longer necessarily about going to certain places. It's about reading old literature. It's about watching old videos, and it's about keeping the candle burning for a once prosperous, successful or religious organization in hopes that it might one day return. So I think that that's kind of roughly where the religion's going. I also I can imagine the day, whether I get to see it. I guess if I live to an old age, I might see it. I expect Warwick to get sold. I think that, obviously I've been to Warwick, as many of you will know. Warwick is a lavish headquarters that has clearly been built with the assumption of continued growth, continued prosperity, continued success. And I just don't see that for Watchtower. I think that, again, as the organization shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, at some point someone's going to have to ask the hard question: what are we doing with this massive headquarters for this tiny and increasingly inconsequential religious movement? We need to sell it. We need to find somewhere that's much, much smaller. So I can imagine the governing body eventually being ensconced in a much smaller compound, much more modest, you could say, arrangements for them. I just, again, having been there and seen how sprawling the Warwick facility is, I don't see it fitting with the trajectory that the organisation is on. Nearly at the end, child abuse. I just wanted to mention what I expect to happen with child abuse. I'm in two minds as to whether the two-witness rule is going to be going anytime soon. It seems to me that the obvious thing for Watchtower to do is to get rid of the two-witness rule and to issue instructions for elders to call police immediately, because activists like myself and the media and the lawyers, basically anyone who knows anything about child sex abuse and how you safeguard children, then they're going to keep banging this drum, and it's never going to go away. And you just have to, you wonder if you're in their shoes, at what point does it all get too much? How many more lawsuits do they have to lose? And they'll keep losing lawsuits, by the way, even if they ditch the 2-witness rule, because they'll still have historic lawsuits to settle. But at least as far as the media and PR and everything is concerned, it's a no-brainer for them to get rid of it. But having said that, we obviously had Gary Bro in the November 2017 JW Broadcasting morning worship segment saying, we will never abandon the 2-witness rule. Albeit he didn't say that in relation to child sex abuse, but it's obvious that's what he was talking about. So I don't know, I'm in two minds. But even if they did get rid of the 2-witness rule, I don't expect that there would be any apology for victims. I don't expect there to be any kind of redress scheme. We will still be left, however Watchtower plays this, however Watchtower deals with their obvious nightmare scenario of what they've done to children, they're always going to have the legacy to deal with, because that stuff, you can't just wave a magic wand and that will go away. You can't even just throw money at it and it goes away. It's always going to be there in the trauma that's been etched onto people emotionally and psychologically. I also expect that they will continue to think that pedophilia is something that you can be sorry for. Now we're really on the home stretch. I was thinking about apostates and how Watchtower will deal with apostates in the future. I think that they will continue to vilify apostates. I think that this troubling new direction of hounding whistleblowers through legal means will continue. If you don't know what I'm talking about, watch the Watchtower in Focus episodes that we've done on subpoena warfare, and the more recent episode that we've just put out, the Dark Spilver debacle, in which we lay everything out. It's just astonishing the way Watchtower is subverting and perverting copyright law as an excuse to literally hunt down whistleblowers, people who they know that they can hurt through shunning. They're not doing... I mean, they sent me a cease and desist, but they're not pursuing the subpoena avenue with me because they know they can't hurt me because I'm already out. But those who are still in, who they can threaten, so vindictive, so evil. It's kind of... I've actually put here in my notes fair game tactics. It feels as though Watchtower is kind of morphing into this version of Scientology when it comes to, anything goes, the ends justify the means when it comes to destroying those who oppose us. So troubling to see that direction, and I do expect that to continue. I think that there will be at some point official direction for witnesses to avoid social media altogether, and YouTube in particular. It may even reach the same sort of stigma that witnesses have for apostate websites. They may be encouraged to think of YouTube in the same way because it's just too easy, especially with stuff like Bottlegate now. How do you watch that footage, by the way, as a believing witness and ever look at Tony Morris seriously again? But anyway, I expect YouTube to be increasingly, shall we say, frowned upon by the leadership and named and singled out in particular. I expect further requests for donations, even to the extent that they might consider tithing. They might find new light to explain why tithing is acceptable. And in general, I just expect a gradual slide to irrelevance, and just a greater onus on building and selling property, which again, I'm not describing anything new. That's kind of what we're already seeing. They're just kind of morphing into, again, this Scientology model of being all about fabulous buildings and look at what we're constructing, and okay, so what? So that's the direction roughly. That's where my mind goes when I think about the future. But again, I'm not clairvoyant. I can't predict these things with any certainty. I just have to tell you what I expect. These are more expectations, and the future will bear out the accuracy, I'm sure. But those were my thoughts. I must again thank my patrons for suggesting this video. They keep suggesting good topics for me to discuss, so I'm very grateful to them. I do hope you found my thoughts helpful. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos, and as always, thank you for watching.